The state's most recent response has sparked a lot of conversation, and with everything that's came out, there's a lot of theories floating around. So what is a bridge too far? What is believable? What will a jury not buy? Was the sheath placed, planted, or is this proof? Well, all that being said, everything's alleged. Welcome to The Point. Let's get to it.
Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976. Allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, scholarship, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use.
Now, just so we're all on the same page, let's talk about what's been said so we can move forward in this conversation. On page 4, the state's response to the defendant's motion in limine, they said this. This included temporal limitations based off the officer's investigation, which limited the search from March 20, 2022 through March 30th, 2022, the time it was known Brian Kohlberger purchased a K-bar knife and sheath with sharpener from Amazon.com. And November 1st, 2022 through December 6, 2022, the time right before and after the passings. Kohlberger's entire click history, items not related to knives and accessories were not relevant. Without any legal basis, the defendant claims the state cherry-picked specific clicks or purchases out of the Amazon click history. This is simply not true unless you consider seeking only items of evidentiary value as cherry-picking. They go on to say this. Second, Kohlberger's click activity after the passings makes it more probable than it would be without the evidence that Kohlberger had a reason to search for a K-bar knife and sheath after the attacks. And as far as how they intend to prove this, you have to go to the footnote on page 6. The state recognizes that the identity of the user making the inquiries is relevant, and the state intends to rely not only on click activity, but also other circumstances to connect the defendant to the original purchase and subsequent search inquiries for a replacement knife and sheath. This will include the defendant's financial activities, the click activities vis-a-vis other events, such as the passings, a related purchase activity connected only to the defendant, and testimony from witnesses with knowledge that the defendant purchased a K-bar knife. Furthermore, in another motion filed by the state, they said this. Instead of challenging the conclusion that the DNA on the knife sheath belonged to the defendant, the defense's expert disclosures reveal that the defense plans to argue the DNA on the knife sheath does not prove the defendant was ever at the crime scene, and the knife sheath itself could have been planted by the real perpetrator. And Ann Taylor said this.
Court's question, good question. What does that mean? Could it mean there's more than one person? The answer to that is, or it could mean it's not Brian because his car's got nothing in it and there were only 13 minutes to do this. The magistrate didn't get to know that.
In fact, his DNA is still on the knife sheath, though. That's the problem, counsel, for probable cause purposes.
Now, yes, this is all from the state's point of view, and we know that the state's going to be biased, but we can't just sit here and assume it's all 100% a lie. That being said, we haven't seen what the defense's reply to all this is yet. They may have an answer, they may have an explanation. We're fair on this channel, this is what's being talked about, this is what's going on. And as I said in my last video, like it or not, it is what it is. This is a huge fact for the state. This is a very bad fact for the defense. It will be a problem if they don't have an answer for what is being alleged right here. Now, that doesn't mean they don't have an answer, and we always know there's at least one or two things that come out at trial that nobody knew about and causes some surprise. And that may happen or it may not. The point is, if all this is true, and if all this holds up, in terms of the theories floating around online, what makes most sense right now? Is this proof Brian did the crime? Does this mean that this was placed? Or does it mean that it was planted? In terms of if this is proof Brian committed the crime, we've all heard what the state said. Yes, it's a bad fact, but in terms of it being proof, we do need to see more. I'm not saying it's ridiculous, just hear me out. This evidence on its own, regardless of these other theories, is not enough. The state cannot get up there and say, we have proof Brian purchased the K-bar, we have proof this is his DNA, and this is all we have, this is enough for first degree. That is not how this works. The evidence required to prove first-degree charges with the DP is significantly higher than any other charge. This is the highest charge. It has the highest bar. So even if all this does hold true, we don't know what else they have. They're going to have to prove he was in the car. They're going to have to prove that he turned his cell phone off. And we don't know whatever evidence they have, but whatever they have, it's going to have to hold up. And I know there's problems with what's available right now in terms of the story. We've talked about it numerous times. I'm not going to constantly rehash things I've already said. There's a playlist available. It will be linked at the end. You can go read it if you want. But in terms of it being proof, it was Brian. That is the basis of all that. Is that the most believable story? And a lot of people don't necessarily believe that. A lot of this is based off how Brian looks and his additional issues that have came out recently. And if what the state is saying that the defense does not intend to argue that that isn't Brian's DNA, then that means that the defense is also believing that's Brian's DNA, which would then require an additional story. One of the theories that came out is that this was planted at the crime scene, meaning somebody's trying to frame Brian Kohlberger for this particular crime. My only initial issue with that particular storyline is it starts to dive into the conspiracy aspect. And I know there's conspiracies out there. I'm not saying they're 100% wrong. It's just what I'm saying is that's a very hard thing to prove in court. Take Karen Reed, for example. All that evidence they had to prove some sort of police conspiracy or cover-up still was not enough to convince a jury. Conspiracies are hard to prove. The who, what, when, where, why has to be answered, and those answers have to be resounding. And quite frankly, defense teams don't really have time to get all those answers. So it leaves holes, it leaves avenues for the state to poke into what they're trying to say. People are saying law enforcement framed them. Fine, you're going to have to show me additional evidence. I'm not saying that everything they did was on the up and up. Do I believe that there's a possibility or a strong possibility they put blinders on? Yes, I do. I still do, even with this new information. I will need to see more before I say that no longer is possible. But them saying they have a proof of purchase that's his DNA, it does make sense for probable cause, and it does make sense why they're pointing the finger at Brian. But if they had the blinders on, there's more to the story. And there could be more possible suspects. But at this time, I'm not willing to go so far to say law enforcement planted Brian's DNA on the sheath. I haven't seen anything in the court records or anything come out of Ann Taylor's mouth to indicate that that's a possibility. If it is, we'll address it, but until then, I gotta kind of set that to the side. In terms of if this was planted in a frame job from somebody else, I would absolutely have to know the who, what, when, where, and why. What is it Brian has done or said to somebody to warrant this type of attack? The reality is we just don't know at this time. I haven't personally, and this is just me personally, you can feel free to disagree, seen any reason for anybody to frame Brian Kohlberger. I understand very early on we did speculate about the possibility of students at WSU doing this, but with more people comes loose lips. Is it 100% impossible? Not necessarily. We had this unidentified DNA found at the crime scene. So in terms of a frame job, the defense is going to have to pay some expert or some analyst to analyze that DNA, figure out who that belongs to. And if it belongs to one of those students at WSU, then so be it. There's a possibility somebody tried to set them up. But of all the theories floating around online, that don't include the state's theory, the one that I would say probably is most believable is the sheath was placed there and it was placed unintentionally. Now, how all this ties together does get a little confusing, but let's go down a couple of pathways. Let's say Brian was involved in this crime, but he wasn't involved in the direct attack of those 4 individuals. He just had a hand in it or planned it. Is that something that is believable? Is it possible to say that he was the driver and the attacker was already in the home? He wiped down the knife sheath, handed it to the attacker, and the attacker used a weapon. They bolted out of the home. They didn't know they left the sheath behind, and now here's where we're at. And I know the initial thing is, well, there's no DNA pointing to anybody but Kohlberger. Well, yes, that's true. But in terms of DNA, there's that unidentified male DNA, and the only DNA linking Brian to the scene is trace DNA. So the sheath being there, whether Brian was involved or not, wasn't intentional. It was an accident. They never meant for this to happen. And in terms of additional suspects who are accomplices to this particular crime, there's loads of theories online. You can go pick one. And then there's the idea that the sheath was stolen or Brian sold the sheath for additional party favors. And whoever it was that ended up with this particular sheath, they're the ones that committed the crime. They wiped down everything as best as they could, and they unintentionally left that sheath behind, and it just so happens there's trace DNA linked to Brian Kohlberger, and that explains how the sheath is there. But the defense is saying he was never in the area during the night of the attack. What is most believable? What is more believable? What is the easiest answer to all these problems? Those individuals who believe Brian is guilty will say what the state is saying is the obvious, simplest answer. And if we're being fair and we're being objective, which most of us are, you have to say there's a possibility that could happen. especially with this most recent information. The state being able to prove that Brian purchased a K-bar and a knife sheath and a sharpener on a particular day, and after the attacks he searched for a replacement knife and sheath, are huge bad facts for the defense. That is one possibility. In terms of those other theories, the other one I say is believable, of course we need more information, is the fact that it was left there unintentionally. And it was left there by the individual who committed the crime. And they either stole or got Brian's DNA by some means that the defense is absolutely 100% gonna have to prove. And that's how we ended up where we're at. I don't believe anybody should be in a hard camp one way or the other with so little information available. We don't know what all evidence the state has, but we're fair on this channel and we don't know what the defense has either. Let's keep a couple of things in mind on some other high-profile trials. Remember how the media coverage was before these trials and how it ended afterwards. Karen Reed, for example, the media headlines before that trial were 100% reiterating what the state said. They had proof Karen Reed hit John O'Keefe with that SUV. They had injuries on John O'Keefe that mirrored what would happen if somebody got hit by a car. But then out of the blue, the FBI hired independent experts. I understand the defense paid them to come down there and testify, but their report is independent. Came out and said there's absolutely no way Karen Reed hit John O'Keefe in that SUV. It is scientifically impossible based off physics, based off their expertise. And those two individuals had PhDs. They didn't have skin in the game when they did their report. And the story about Richard Allen and that round found at the crime scene. The headline was, this round belonged to Richard Allen. This ties him to the crime scene. This is the bad fact. But as it turns out, when the state's expert took the stand, she said she tested other weapons. And she could not exclude other weapons tested. And for her to get that potential match, she had to alter the way the round was found. At the crime scene, the bullet was not fired. For her to say she got a match, she had to fire the weapon. And she also said her expertise was subjective, meaning it's open for interpretation. So these big key pieces of evidence we're hearing about in the headlines don't necessarily always pan out. We don't know what all the defense has. Everybody needs to be flexible and calm down. Stop speaking in absolutes. We don't know what happened. If Brian is involved in this crime, we don't know how he was involved. If he was involved and directly tied to this, he acted alone, okay, the state has to prove it. In terms of the potential that he was involved in this crime, I would say he's more involved as an accomplice. Maybe he was the driver or the planner. Maybe he never actually went inside the home, or whatever he did inside the home wasn't very much. And maybe that explains the lack of DNA found in the car, in the apartment, and inside the home. Honestly, I have no clue. This story as a whole is absolutely blowing my mind. There are more reasons now to believe Brian had some sort of involvement in this crime based off that most recent motion. We'll see what the defense says in terms of if it's valid or not. Everybody's got to prove their particular point. Now I understand there's a lot of stuff left out of these videos, but I'm keeping my videos short. Feel free to disagree at any point in time, or feel free to plug in a hole of a particular part of this conversation. But if you enjoy this and a more fair, open conversation, maybe check one of these videos out. Y'all be safe now.